What's wrong with socialism? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that y'all know brings you the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy as it has for many, many years. And I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel, who's taking it easy this summer. Richard, good to see you again.
Oh, yeah. Viewers and listeners, I was just telling Jacob that my wife and I are in our backyard and staining our fence. Yeah, just taking it easy with a brush, brushing each plank. Yeah, we're just taking it easy this summer. Okay.
Just like Tom
Don't believe a
Sawyer.
word he says, or at least you can believe the political stuff, but this other stuff, take it with a grain of salt.
Okay, Richard, this is what I want to talk about this week. It's a subject that is near and dear to your heart. You've studied this subject for most of your professional life and even before your professional life, but we've never really talked specifically about it, and that's socialism. And so the theme is going to be what's wrong with socialism. And so I'll lead out because I know that you're a Austrian economist and you've devoted much of your professional life to opposing socialism. But I think it would help to know why you've done that. What is it that you have against socialism? Because look, your opposition to socialism clearly reflects that you hate the poor, needy, and disadvantaged. I mean, really, isn't that what socialists always say when you oppose socialist programs?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, though, if we didn't have socialism in America, like Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and so forth, public schooling, people would be dying in the streets, kids would go uneducated, everybody would be stupid. And so, or should I say stupider? And, socialism seems to be a big benefit, an important benefit to a society. I mean, if it's keeping people alive and keeping people educated. So let me just start out by drawing a distinction, though. That a fully fledged socialist society would be one, or is one, where the government owns everything. The government is the sole employer and everybody works for the state. Now, when the Berlin Wall came crashing down, the Soviet Union got dismantled, I decided to put an application into the Treasury Department to go visit Cuba. And my rationale for this, because here in the United States, you have to ask for permission before you can travel to certain countries and spend money in certain countries. That they call it a fundamental right, but you got to ask for permission to exercise it. But one of my rationales that I told them, I said, look, I run this free market libertarian educational foundation, and the communist system, socialist system in Cuba could collapse at any moment too. So I'd like to see it firsthand before it dismantles. And so going over there was quite fascinating because for all practical purposes, the state in Cuba owns everything. I mean, there's some minor exceptions. There was like a book fair, and they were starting to let people have restaurants in their homes, like in their personal dining room. But by and large, the state owns everything. And it was fascinating to see. And it just boggled the mind. I mean, you'd walk down the streets of Havana, like downtown, and there'd be, gray walls and the old rundown stores, the pharmacies, all the shelves would be bare. And it just struck me that this is what socialism, when the state owns everything. And it was shocking to think that everybody works for the government. Everybody's a government employee. Quite stunning, and certainly not the kind of life that I would want to live. But then you've got the variations, the lesser socialist type systems, and that would be the United States. I mean, the United States is ostensibly based on a free market system, but yet a predominant section of this economy is socialist oriented. We've got Social Security. It's a classic socialist program. Takes money from young people through the force of taxation and gives it to older people. And in the name of compassion and caring, because we all know how caring and compassionate the IRS is. And then Medicare we're told that, oh, that this is all to be providing health care for the elderly and Medicaid for the poor, and public schooling. You couldn't find a better example of a socialist program. The state owns and runs the public schooling system. They determine the curriculum. All the teachers are government employees. The Federal Reserve, as you've pointed out in your book, Monetary Central Planning in the State, is a socialist edifice because it's based on the socialist principle of monetary central planning. So you've got a variation on a theme here. The government obviously here in the United States doesn't own the means of production. They effectively own the results of production with income taxation. They determine what percentage it will be, and therefore it's really an allowance that they're letting people keep part of the money, but they determine how much that allowance is going to be. And it's probably worth noting that a progressive income tax was part of the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto. And so I don't think it should surprise anyone. Oh, another example, immigration controls. Classic example of the central planning of the free movements of people, central planning of a labor movement. So I don't think it should surprise anyone that every one of these systems is in crisis. I mean, this is what we've been saying for years, for decades, Richard, that socialism is the bane of mankind. It produces crises and chaos. We see this in education, immigration, monetary policy, Social Security, Medicare. It's always in crisis and always needing reform. And so what's wrong with socialism? Well, my answer would be just about everything. What do you think?
Well, comrade, Jacob, there's several levels of the critique of socialism that a friend of freedom, a classical liberal or libertarian, could make. I would argue that at one fundamental philosophical level, it's the issue of who should have primary responsibility for the running of your life. The philosophy of freedom, the liberal tradition since John Locke and the American founding fathers, have presumed that the individual has a right by nature or an endowment by God, if you are religious, to his own life, his own liberty, and that which he has honestly produced or acquired through voluntary and free exchange as property. And that the individual, while we all have imperfect knowledge and are far from being perfect people, know far better what is in our own best interest than others. We often will look backwards and say, gosh, that was a dumb decision. Or if I had only knew before I made this choice. But the fact is that we, each of us, have the most motivation and incentive to try to get it right rather than wrong in what will be good for our life, what will give meaning and purpose and value to our life. What are the best means and approaches and methods to achieve the ends, goals, and purposes that we have chosen freely to pursue to achieve those meanings and values and purposes for our life. And that government, whether it be a municipal government or certainly those in a faraway national capital like Washington, D.C., they have no knowledge of your life and who you are and your circumstances and your beliefs and your desires and your hopes and your dreams and how you see the opportunities around you as opposed to they. So the primary idea is that the individual has a right to his own life, to guide it, direct it, give it meaning and purpose, as I said, and to be let alone to freely find ways and avenues to achieve those good things in free and voluntary association with other individuals in his society who have equivalent rights. The other aspect of this is that it is impossible to have any form of socialism in which government pervasively not just owns, but even if it doesn't own, control, regulate, mandate, it necessarily means the end of freedom. If the government is going to have a plan, either a comprehensive centralized plan or a series of related and sometimes even contradictory incremental plans, this is going to be our farm policy. This is going to be our protectionist trade policy. This is going to be our our minimum wage law policy. These are all forms of planning wages, planning what can be imported, what can be grown, how much can be grown, whether it can be grown, what industries will develop here through a government subsidy, which ones will be nudged away from there by some prohibitory regulation or tax. All of these are forms of planning in which, by definition, the government uses its forms of power and force, either taxation or regulation or just direct control, to determine what your life is. This was the theme of Friedrich Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, that once you introduce these various forms of planning, the plans of the government and those who manage and control the individuals making these decisions in government must make you subservient and submissive within those plans. You must obey and follow within them. In other words, your life is co-opted to serve what others think your life should be as part of a greater collective whole that they have a vision would be right for all of us in society. Then finally, there's the economic argument, which you alluded to towards the beginning. You said, I've had this interest in Austrian economics. I've written a bit about it over the years. The Austrian argument is that institutionally, not only does socialism mean the abridgment of personal freedom, but institutionally, it does not have the means and methods to even do as well as a market economy in efficiently using the scarce resources at people's disposal and directing them in ways that will satisfy the wants of the general consuming public. That is, all of us as you and me. Why? Because the government either abolishes or restricts through controls the operation of prices in the market. Prices are a means of people communicating with each other. Just as we can communicate about, well, capitalism versus socialism and try to argue and persuade and reason with us. In the marketplace, we talk through prices. This is what I'd be interested in buying. This is the relative value in terms of the price I'd be willing to pay, higher or lower. As a producer on the supply side, this is what I think I could produce in an efficient and more effective way than my competitive rival, also trying to gain the consumer business. And these are the prices at which I think I could bring it to market based upon my discovery of what the resources are worth in competitive bids of me and my other competitive rivals to hire them, purchase them, use them in different ways, the opportunity costs of the scarce resources in society. And therefore, through input prices and output prices, people are informed as consumers and producers what could be done, which might be done, how it can be done, whether it be profitable or loss-making. But socialism does away with this in the direct and extreme form, as we've seen in the communist countries, the Soviet Union, China under Mao. It's still a planned economy, but it isn't that Stalinist version that Mao had. When the government owns everything, it has abolished private property. It has negated the ability for people to buy and sell. If there's no buying and selling, people have no incentive to make bids and offers. If there's no bids and offers, there's no higgling and haggling of the marketplace. And if there's no higgling and haggling in the marketplace, there are no agreed upon terms of trade. Well, let's settle on it. These money jacks for so many marbles, right? That's what a price amounts to for anything. And if we do not have prices, then how do we know what goods consumers want and the value they place upon them? This for hats, this for salt, this for bananas, this for a computer, and so on and so forth. And on the manufacturing side, what are these types of skilled and qualified laborers worth in different types of employment? What is the best or best possible economic ways of applying capital, making these goods and services to satisfy these consumer demands, or these goods and services to satisfy these other consumer demands? We prevent people from talking and communicating with each other. As I like to say, it's like someone putting their hand over your mouth, and don't forget a word that I just said. You can't hear them. And that's what government, either controlling prices or abolishing prices, does. That is and therefore, that is why in every socialist system, particularly ones that pervasively attempted to plan and over the last 100 years, how it inevitably brought about imbalances between supply and demand, inefficiencies, wastefulness, shoddiness of products. You said you had visited Cuba. As you know, maybe some of the viewers and listeners may remember, in the end years of the Soviet Union, 1990, 91, I was traveling to the Soviet Union very frequently, doing consulting work on privatization and market reform. But as with you, Jake, it gave me a chance to see socialism in practice in the birth heartland of socialism first implemented in a comprehensive way in Soviet Russia. The dilapidatedness of all infrastructure, the disinterestedness of everyone who's working for the government in being concerned with what goods should be produced, or the satisfaction of consumers, the disregard for quality or interest in making a good product. Because you see, in the marketplace, the only way you make money is by making a product that is better and less expensive than your rival. Otherwise, in the free market, you can buy his version rather than yours. Now, in socialism, it's the only game in town. If you don't like the government-made shoes, where else do you get shoes? Other than maybe smuggled in black market shoes, of course. Where do you get food? Where do you get clothing? Where do you get eyeglasses? Where do you get pharmaceuticals? And if the government hasn't allocated resources in sufficient quantities to make, as they've decided, are the necessary quantities of these finished goods and services, including medical products, they're not available. And the scanty supplies will have to be allocated some way. And invariably, the plan determines that. So you have the special stores where the Communist Party leaders and the factory managers would have special access to, or they would be stolen from these government supply chains and they'd be sold on the black market. Corruption, inefficiency, a mismatching of too much of things people don't want, too little of the things that they actually want. That was the reality of it. Now, do we have that extreme form in the United States? Of course not. But if we define socialism as not merely the ownership of the means of production, but government direction and planning and restricting of private activities in economic aspects of life, there is absolutely no doubt that we have a heavily command-directed economy through government regulations and fiscal policy. The government is trying to reindustrialize the country. The government says we have to decouple from China, which means they want to have supply chains here rather than how the market has chosen to decide to have them globally, including China as part of that. We have to have certain manufacturing jobs here. We have to assure certain agricultural products here. We have to assure, which means the government either gets it by taxing us and getting the resources directed that way through direct government contracts to private businesses. Here's a price that makes it attractive to produce something for the government as opposed for the private sector. Or they manipulate the tax code to make it more of an incentive for you to be prodded to go where the government wants you as opposed to otherwise. But they just prohibit you. Now, the most extreme form of this prohibition are these sanctions against Russia, which the United States has presumed it has the authority to impose on the rest of the world. What have they tried to do to China to intimidate them not to sell anything to Russia right now with this war in Ukraine that the United States government defines as supporting of the war effort? They're threatening sanctions against China. Under what authority do they do this? They're attempting to plan the flows of everything around the entire planet. But that's a form of planning, and it has to be accepted as so. Now, one other thing, Jacob, if I can mention this. Traditionally, our opponents have been on what is usually colloquially called the left. They're the ones who want to redistribute wealth by the government. They want to plan, or they want to manipulate through government regulation how things are done. But now we see this on, quote, the conservative side as well. There's a growing segment of nationalist conservatives who don't believe in the free market. The free market panders to the wrong things. The free market doesn't assure national greatness, national military capability, national proper development. And therefore, they have their own versions of wanting to impose planning, regulations, and controls that are slightly different, but parallel to what their supposed enemies on the left want to do in the United States. And that's what makes the current circumstances a lunging back in the socialist direction, even more than we had been experiencing up till now, by virtually a wide swath of the entire political spectrum in the United States.
Well, you raise a lot of good points. Let me just address two or three of them. One is a follow-up to what you were saying about sanctions in China and Russia and so forth. I recall that woman who was executive of that Chinese company called Huawei, that they indicted here in the United States and caused the Canadian government to take her in under arrest. I mean, this woman was a high executive in this company. She's not your standard criminal type, and yet they held her under house arrest, I think, for about a year. Why? Because her company has supposedly violated U.S. sanctions against Iran. I mean, why does the U.S. jurisdiction extend to Chinese citizens who are trading with Iran? That's their business.
Yes.
Well, not under this central planning model where they're international central planners. And the other thing that you raised is what is commonly called the socialist calculation debate, I think that you were alluding to. And I remember when I first read about this, Richard, when I was first getting into Austrian economics, I was just fascinated because it seemed that Ludwig von Mises really had shown the fatal defect of socialism.
Yes.
That if you imagine that the entire world is socialist, nobody trades in a socialist system because the state owns everything. So there's no trades going on. So there's no prices. Prices come into existence because people are trading things. They're buying, they're selling, they're investing or whatever. But when the state owns everything, none of that's taking place. So how does the state calculate? How do they know whether to spend their money here or to spend their money when there's no prices? So it's like in the impossibility of rational calculation under socialism. And that, for me, was a devastating, I think, fatal critique of socialism, the inability to rationally calculate under a socialist system. In fact, I think what the socialists were doing during the Cold War was looking at over what the prices were in the United States and sort of copying them in their socialist system to provide some appearance of rationality. And the other thing I want to say is that, you know, the confiscation of wealth that comes with socialism always presumes there's wealth. I mean, that's just the natural assumption. When you see socialists here in the United States talking about the disparities of wealth there and how we need to equalize wealth, that presupposes that there's wealth in that society. But what happens if there's no wealth at all? What if everybody's desperately poor? Everybody's just eking out a survival. Then what good is your socialist system? You nationalized everything, and yet now there's no productivity. I mean, there's nothing to confiscate. And we saw this in Cuba. You know, I'm not suggesting that before Castro there was a capitalist system, but what I am saying, it was more like a fascist type system, corporatist type system. But I am suggesting that there was a large amount of wealth in Cuba, and they immediately nationalized the wealth. And so for the first couple of years, 3 or 4 years, oh man, the socialists are having a great time, and they're hailed as heroes because they're giving out this wealth to the poor. But after those 3 or 4 years are up, it's over. They've taken over the businesses that now they can't produce because they don't know how to run them like private entrepreneurs can. And so now everybody is desperately poor. And their only hope is to free up some of the market that starts producing wealth so they can start confiscating it again. And this gets back to what are the causes of wealth in a society? You know, you often hear socialists saying, what are the causes of poverty? Well, that's a ridiculous question because poverty is the natural state of mankind. It's what causes wealth. That's the real question. And when you get government out of economic activity, that is the cause of wealth. And that's what Americans proved throughout the 19th century. There was no Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, income taxation, immigration controls, central banking. It was a totally different system. And the tremendous amount of wealth that came into existence was something that shocked the world. This is why thousands of penniless immigrants were flooding American shores to participate in this bounty, unbelievable bounty. But notice that as soon as the socialists started seeing this enormous amount of capital and wealth that a genuine free market society had brought into existence, they immediately say, we need to start equalizing, we need to start taking. And I think one of the major driving forces behind that impulse is envy and covetousness. They simply cannot stand the thought that in a genuine free market economy, there's going to be people that have more than and people who have less. And so they'd rather equalize everybody to the point where everybody's just barely surviving than to have a society where the poor really are experiencing high standards of living, albeit with less wealth than the wealthy.
Yeah, there's a line, I'm not going to get the wording exactly right, that supposedly Margaret Thatcher said at one point, is that socialism works for as long as there's other people's money to take. When that money runs out, you're out of luck. And the other quote, I'm just going to quickly see if I can find this. If I can't, in just a moment. Yes. This is from Thomas Sowell. What is your fair share of what someone else has worked for? What is your fair share of what someone else has worked for?
That's great.
Well, I mean, that gets at this envy and covetousness thing as well. You see, one of the most dangerous and perverse misuses of language, in my opinion, has been the word equality. In the American traditional sense, the founding fathers and so on, it wasn't presumed that we are guaranteed or is assured, or the natural condition is an equality of wealth. The fact is, we're different as individuals. Our parents are different, our education is different, our home life is different, our interests, proclivities, motives, incentives are different. We're just different as people. Anyone who has had children and has watched them grow up sees that even when there's only maybe a year between the siblings, whether they're the same sex or different sexes, their personalities end up being totally different. I have two granddaughters. They're both in their 20s now. But when they were small, from the day the second one was born, they were just like, like opposites. They're getting on each other's nerves, their personalities, their interests. I mean, that people are just different. Now, once we accept that people are different, we have to realize that what those differences are going to result in are going to be different as well. So what is the only equality that matters given our natural differentness? And that is equality before the law. Before John Locke and the American experiment of limited constitutional government, it was the idea that there was privilege, there was favor, there was a king, there was a nobility, an aristocracy, and they used the legal system to give themselves positions in society that were both inherited and untouchable by someone wanting to compete against them or achieve wealth in a way that would undermine their privileged positions. But the idea of the rule of law and equality before the law is that each of us have the same rights and we have the same equal opportunities. That is, no government restrictions, no government favors, no government privileges. But that means that while we all have an equal rights before the law to try, to do, to freely interact on mutually agreed upon terms with others, there's no guarantee of what the outcome will be. The fact is, some people have chosen their parents wisely and picked parents who had genes that resulted in them being 7 feet tall. And if they have an interest and inclination, they're more likely to become a professional and therefore rather well-paid basketball player. Now, I was not in that category. And nor was I ever given a physique to be like Mr. Universe. That's just the way it is. And the fact is, people have different interests and inclinations. I see this as a professor, right? These are people who are in college because they're there because they want to. Either their own motive or their parents said you have to get a college education, but they're there because in that sense they want to. But you know what? Not everybody's interested in the same subject to the same degree. Not everyone has the same discipline to study, to do well, even if a subject isn't coming to them easily. And some people don't give a damn. Oh, I'm just going to get by. I'll get my C or B. I'll get my degree, and I'll just because I'm just here to get the degree as a union card to get a job in a certain field, and that's what they call that. People are different, and once you accept that people are different, then the outcomes of the interactive races of society, the competitions of society, are going to result in different outcomes. The classical liberal, the friend of freedom, says, as long as there's no privileges, favors, restrictions imposed by law and government, then the outcomes are just. Doesn't mean all of us achieve the things that we'd like to achieve. I'm going to let the world into a secret. It would be nice if I had won a Nobel Prize in economics. I know, but I didn't. That's life. So what? Get over it. Move on. Get a life. But if you allow this to fester in you and eat at you, oh, he did better. I didn't do this. Oh, it must be someone else's fault. That envy and resentment that you were talking about. It easily leads it. Well, they have it for some reason that's been at my expense, and somebody should correct it. And that becomes government, because the government is the agency that has the ability to force outcomes rather than free outcomes of the marketplace.
Yeah, as you were talking, I was remembering a book that I read many, many years ago when I first discovered the libertarian philosophy, called You Are Extraordinary. You remember that book by Roger
Yes.
Williams?
Yes, yes.
Oh, it's fantastic. This guy's thesis is that every single person who has ever been born and lived is different from every other person in every respect. I mean, we all know about the fingerprints being different. Williams says everything about you is different, not just the fingerprints, your voice, your skin color, your even like the shape of your kidney is different from everybody else's kidney. And his idea was that you are unique. Every single person is a unique, a one of a kind, and with special talents, abilities, interests, or whatever. And that it's only in a climate of freedom that each person can nourish what and discover and develop what he is to become, to what Leonard Read, the Foundation for Economic Education founder, call hatching, that each person is hatching, and in a free market society provides that opportunity, as compared to a socialist society where everybody's like, they're out of a cookie cutter mold. They're all the same little ones. They're all wearing their same little uniforms, like in North Korea, and they're all alike instead of being treated as unique. And then finally, Richard, I think it's worth pointing out too what socialism does to a nation. It really destroys the moral fiber of a nation. It makes a nation weaker. The more powerful your government, the weaker your nation. And we can see that in terms of Social Security and Medicare. I mean, people are scared to death of losing their Social Security and their Medicare. It's like a narcotic. You get hopelessly hooked on this socialist narcotic, and you think, I could never survive. Well, this is nonsense. America survived without these socialist programs for more than 100 years, and people did fine. And what we need to do is recapture the faith and freedom that people right now have in government. I mean, that's where their faith is placed, in the omnipotent power of the state, the IRS. If we rediscover and recapture our faith and freedom, we can get rid of these programs immediately. A lot of people have enough wealth, they don't need them. A lot of people might have to go back to work. There's nothing wrong with that, working in your senior years, as you and I both know, Richard. And then for the truly needy, that's what genuine care and compassion is all about. Children having the opportunity to help out parents in their later years with sickness or impending death. It's a very rewarding and gratifying experience for a kid to be able to have that opportunity to give back to his parents what they gave to him. And we have church groups and we have neighborhood groups. We need to recapture that sense of voluntarism that comes with a freedom philosophy and a freedom society, as compared to the socialist system, socialist programs that we have today.
Yeah, an extension of that is a point that Friedrich Hayek made a point of emphasizing quite frequently. And that is, we can either have a society in which we all have the same equal rights before the law, but inevitably a huge variety of different individual outcomes based upon the type of factors that I mentioned earlier. Or you can try to make everyone equal by some benchmark. But once you want to have equal outcomes, you end up having to treat the individuals very differently. That is an inequality before the law. Let's take a foot race. Some people are faster runners than others. So if we're going to assure that everyone goes across the finish line, let's say in the extreme case, at the same moment, that means that weights are going to have to be attached to the ankles of the faster runners, or the slower runners are going to be given the privilege of cutting across the field to not have to follow the course of the track to get quicker to the finish line than other players. Now, what is fair about that? Because the only way that you determine who's to have the weights attached to their ankles or who's going to be allowed to cut across the field to get to the finish line quicker are those in political power. Do you want to have your destiny, your future, your life opportunities determined by classifications that they impose upon us as groups and subgroups, whether it be race or gender or class or any numeral of others they want to assign, and then our fates being determined on that basis for the rest of our lives and our children's life and our inability to escape from that? If a person steps back and thinks about it, surely it is better to have the latitude and liberty to make your own future, even though most of us never achieve all the goals and purposes and dreams that we had as young people, but to know that we had degrees of attempting and maybe achieving some of them. And if we didn't, we know, well, it's my life and this is just the outcome. I've not been controlled by another in planning and imposing this on me and everyone else in society. Those are the things that, in my humble opinion, make liberty invaluable.
Yeah. And building on that, there's also the phenomenon of geniuses, extraordinarily talented people in society, like a Mozart or a Beethoven or some technological genius that socialism smashes out of existence. They never let him develop into that. And so a socialist society is deprived of those extraordinary people, Van Goghs, that just bring so much happiness into your life because they're left alone to do their thing. If they want to play the piano all day long from the time they're 2 years old, instead of studying geography and Texas history or whatever, so what? That socialism destroys that. So, okay, Richard, we went way over time, I think. And that's it for this week. Thank you all very much for tuning in. Sorry we went over time. I hope you all enjoyed the discussion. Come and visit us at fff.org for 34 years of principled articles and videos on freedom. And Richard, I look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.